So what have we laid out so far? We've laid out how the stock market affects us all, and how those companies create everything we use, and how we are not represented in that, theoretically somewhat democratic space. You buy your votes, but there's votes. We've talked about how when you aren't represented in that space, we all kind of get screwed. And we've talked about some solutions about what we can all do about it, right? So now we're going to move up the chain one step and look at these guys that own everything, right? And we're also going to move up the chain one step closer to content that, let's say, YouTube would not want you to talk about. Someone was reporting my TikTok live stream for hateful content when I just turned it back on, as I was standing in the back talking about drinking water and waiting to come out here. So clearly someone is unhappy that we're talking about these things. If anyone brought small children here, which I don't think you did, I am about to talk to you about the opium trade. We are about to start touching on the Jeffrey Epstein networks, so just be warned. My favorite thing about this place is that we're here to tell the truth. And the truth is sometimes it's great and sometimes it's not, and it is what it is, and we're going to go wherever it goes. So, why is it even called the banker's black ops? Well, the market, the whole world has two sides. It has the side that sees the light, and it has the side that is supposed to stay in the dark. And we all know there's a black market everywhere, but no one really talks about it, except for like high schoolers when they're looking for trouble. And they don't really realize what the dark underbelly of the world they're actually kind of tickling down there is. Because this is just my opinion, but based upon what I've learned and based upon what we're about to talk about, I think you will hopefully at least partially agree with me that it is not an accident that the black market lives in its own private sphere and is enormous in the way that it is and includes the industries that it includes, because it is extremely beneficial to the people that benefit from the black market that it is set up the way that it is. And the people that benefit from the black market, we are told that they're like these criminals that, are running from the law, and that's not really what's going on. Because, there's the drug market is the obvious one. And we like to think of illegal drugs as being this illegal drug market that drug lords, cartel lords, they're the ones profiting off of it. But there is a whole legal drug market. And a lot of these days, a lot of the drugs that are ravaging the streets these days are opioids that are, not that different. And so there's two sides to the drug market. And it's not entirely clear if the line is very clear who's on which side of that market. And if you want an example, I would point to the Sackler family, who was responsible for starting the opioid epidemic when they started making all this oxycodone back when I was in high school, right when we had very conveniently invaded Afghanistan, that allegedly had a lot to do with 9/11, but literally the people that allegedly did that were not from Afghanistan. But there is a lot of opium production in Afghanistan. We'll also talk about the opium production over in Vietnam that was very useful prior. And suddenly we're in Afghanistan, and suddenly there's an opioid epidemic. And those opioids are coming out of legal pharmaceutical companies, namely the Sackler family and many of the others. And fortunately, the Sackler families got drastically punished. The government took a bunch of money from them, and they suffered, and they would never do it again. Now they're just poor billionaires living out their lives as billionaires. I'm sure they regret it. So the drug market has two sides. And it's important to remember that the line is not entirely clear, even when you just look at the drugs and you don't look upwards at the money. And we're going to get to the money in a minute. The weapons market is an obvious one, where there is a totally legitimate market for weapons, because our government is bragging about how many of them they're selling every frickin' day. They're just selling them to, countries that need to defend themselves. But those companies that are producing those weapons, like, that is the arms market. And the only difference between the weapons that we're giving to that country because we said that's okay, and the weapons that are going to the cartel that we said is not okay, is because we've been told a narrative that what those guys are doing with those weapons is for the good of everyone, it's for democracy, and what those guys are doing with those weapons is bad. And that might be true, and I don't know. But I know that for every mafia boss that got his hands on a gun, you could find a kid in his borough that says that guy protects me when the police don't. And I'm not saying the mafia is good. I'm saying that stories are complicated. And for every gun you send over to a soldier who is like a sanctioned violence committer, sure you could find someone who thinks that person murdered my family, right? So guns are guns and violence is violence. And I think we are all, probably educated enough gun owners to understand that that is a very serious responsibility. And the people that are selling those guns are not thinking about that responsibility when they're making all that money. There are two sides to that market. And the line is not always very clear which side is which. And we'll probably talk a little bit about the CIA really enjoying selling guns to very questionable people all throughout history. Human trafficking is a lot clearer. At least it seems that way, right? Human trafficking is evil. It's illegal. And hopefully we don't talk about it too much because I hate it. But we will touch on it a little bit. But there are also other sort of like gray area markets that feed into human trafficking. There are lots of markets like the modeling industry, like Hollywood, that are uncomfortably close to human trafficking, and we have a barrier keeping us from hearing about just how close that is. But then you can get a little more, shall we say, intangible with it, because services, intelligence, like assassination is a service, money laundering is needed for all these things. Like, those are markets that are more obviously black market operations. But these are things that we don't often talk about, how valuable they are, how profitable they are, and how prevalent they are around the world, because the news is not telling you about them, which is kind of weird, because you would think the news's job is to hold the powerful to account and to tell us like what's really going on in this world, but they tend to just have us arguing about cultural things, which sometimes are important, but, sorry, I just don't want to get excited and spill water all over the place. So, once again, let's rewind, right back to the beginning, my arbitrary beginning. But I like to come back to sort of the same point in history over and over and over again, because the world changed a lot when international sailing, when cross-Atlantic, transatlantic sailing came to be. Because suddenly economies were able to grow in a way they hadn't before, technology were able to grow in a way they hadn't before, money was able to consolidate and achieve things that it had never been able to do before, and intelligence, as in like spy services, as in, espionage and intelligence gathering, really took on a whole new life, right? Because it's a very simple thought process where, like, if you're going to run a business where you're going to sail around Africa and go and, grow opium in India and then import it into China, and China doesn't want you to, so there's so many levels of, like, questions that you need to answer before you venture out on that voyage. You need to know, can we sail around Cape Town? What is the climate in South Africa politically? Can we grow this in India, or is India going to kick us out? Because it'll take us, 2 years to even get this all spun up. What's going on in India? What's the politics there? Can we take them over? Can we make them into a serf state? When we start selling this opium into China, what's going to happen? Like, are they going to kick us out? Are they going to start a war? They did, spoiler. But that's like all stuff you need to know before you go into that business venture, right? And the same is true of a small business venture. Like, you want to buy a bar in, Eagle, Idaho. You should do some research. That research is intelligence gathering. And the initial intelligence networks were corporate, not governmental, right? Like, the CIA was founded after World War II. And before that, the US did not even have an intelligence agency. Other countries had intelligence agencies for longer, but the origins of intelligence agencies is actually corporate. And it's pretty obvious why that is, right? Because money's involved, and you need to know what you're doing. And the East India Trading Company is a famous example that had a whole lot of intelligence gathering all around the world. One of the other really famous ones that comes up in conspiracy circles a lot is sort of the origin story of the Rothschilds related to the Battle of Waterloo. And this is an important one to understand that, like, the stories differ, the tellings of it differ. It's probably true in, general form. It's hard to say what's true about it. But in general, the story goes that in the Battle of Waterloo, either Nathan Mayer Rothschild's spy guy was at the battle and saw it end, or he was there himself. I suspect that he likes to tell the story where he was there himself. He rode through the night super fast, rode back to England with the news, crossed the channel, got there a day before the official news, and was like, the story generally goes that he created this panic by selling all of his stuff to make it look like they had lost, and everyone freaked out because they were like, oh no, the Rothschilds know we lost, sell your stuff right now. But actually they had won. He waited for it to go down. He bought everything up at a discount with all this money he just made because he started the panic on himself. And then he made off with this huge percentage of the English stock market. That's how the story goes. And there's various tellings of it, but it's more or less corroborated. It's kind of the original pump and dump scheme. And it's based on intelligence. It's based on the fact that if you have a faster intelligence network than the other people trading in the markets or, engaging in the business atmosphere, then you can outsmart them, you can act before them, you can undercut them, you can trick them, you can take over their entire economy, depending on, many factors. You can trace the origins of intelligence all over the world, all the way back in time. Intelligence is like, and I don't mean I mean like spies. Spies are fundamental to any city-state, to any society, to any time people are gathering together with objectives and there's anyone else anywhere else that has other objectives, intelligence wins that war first and foremost. Sun Tzu writes about it, the English write about it, all around the world. So, during the age of sail, all of these technologies are getting invented. Tall ships, cannons, guns, opium. And stealing technology is one of the most profitable things you can do. That's true today, when most of Chinese hacking into America is actually just them stealing our technology and then going and producing them and selling it back to us on Timo for cheaper. And that's kind of a joke, but it's also like they do that with military secrets, with like intelligence, with like weapons and bombs. But that's true all the way back there, is we invented this new kind of ship, and we need to protect that invention because if we can guard this new kind of ship that can move 2 times as fast, and we can keep that proprietary for 3 years, we can suddenly, be 1/3 bigger than the Dutch or 1/3 bigger than the Portuguese. Like, that can change the whole world back then when there's only 4 or 5 players on the board and ventures take years and years to play out. That's a crazy world, and these technologies were changing everything. And no sooner did they realize that they were all competing technologically, that the trade started to be the competition too. I mean, trade has always been competition, but it took on a new scope. The moment that you can sail across the ocean, I mean, we don't think about this very often, but like, imagine if you had to walk all of your goods with a horse everywhere you wanted to trade, and then suddenly someone can, take 10,000 times as much stuff somewhere 10 times as fast. Everything exploded. And more so than most, drugs exploded. Because when you're putting a bunch of stuff on a boat, it really matters how big and how heavy it is. And drugs are pretty small and super valuable, right? And some drugs were not invented yet, but opium was. And opium is one of the oldest sort of like drugs of abuse or drugs of trade that is still around today, still traded today. And it started a whole cascading cycle of change in the world, as well as 2 wars called the Opium Wars. And everyone was kind of in on the trade, but in a big way, the British Empire was the opium trade. And they were trading all over the place, but their biggest target was China. And they realized that, this is a plant that we can grow. And it is worth a lot of money. And like literally we can grow money. Because what they had been doing is the British really like tea, if you didn't know. And China makes all the tea. And so they're trading for all the tea, and they're giving away all their silver to China. And they're starting to run out of silver, but they still want more tea. And they've got too much silver, and they're doing fine with their tea. They're making tea. And the British realized, like, man, opium is a way better thing to trade than silver, because we can grow opium. We cannot grow silver. And we can get them addicted to opium. And the British Empire, and by British Empire, I mean the corporation, the East India Trading Company, basically devised a scheme over, a decade or so. They infiltrated China and worked to establish opium dens, to encourage opium use, to put out the kinds of not the propaganda that we know today, but to put out propaganda to normalize opium use within China, because the more that you can get people in China smoking opium, the more opium you can sell them. And the more opium you sell them, the more opium they want to use. And the opium was all grown in India. All the British influence in India is because it was a vassal state of the British Empire, which was actually just this corporation, not the actual crown. Like, this corporation, the East India Trading Company, had basically just said, we'll take care of it all. We'll build an army that is bigger than the British Empire. We'll do all the trade, and we'll cut you in on it. And so for a while there, the East India Trading Company was essentially just out there on their own, being a corporate empire, taking over countries, getting all of China addicted to opium, selling a lot of saltpeter, which is the precursor to gunpowder. So, guns, drugs. And China got really pissed. And eventually, China was like, you are destroying our culture, our economy. Right? When a whole country starts to get addicted to drugs, it gets pretty obvious. It starts to look like San Francisco, and everyone's bending over, and everyone's like, guys, this is not what's up. And they had it. And China kind of did the dump the tea in the river thing. It wasn't about taxes. It was just about, you guys are getting us all addicted to drugs. And so China got mad and destroyed a shipment of opium. And the British were like, we got to teach them a lesson. So they went to war with China for China being like, don't get us addicted to drugs, attacked them. They started the first opium war. And to be clear, it was the East India Trading Company started the first opium war, because you're dang straight, you're going to take our drugs and you're going to like it. And they beat China up. They killed a lot of people. And then they forced China to pay for the damage they had received in that war and prior. And they made them sign a whole bunch of treaties that said, we'll accept all of your opium, we won't outlaw it, you can trade all the opium you want, and we'll say please and thank you. And the British continued to do it, and it went really well. And then they started a whole other war about it, the Second Opium War, and it basically repeated again. And that is why, China calls it, what did they call it? They call it the lost century, the century of embarrassment. They have a name for it. It's off the tip of my tongue. And they remember it very much culturally, because they got absolutely screwed by the British. And not just the British, everyone else was getting in on it too. It's like the British and the French, Portuguese. This is a general map of what was going on. Ships sailing around the bottom of Africa and over into the zone where all the opium is being grown in India, in the red. And then it's all being shipped in and out by sea and shipped in and out across land. And all of that starts to create trafficking networks, right? And all of that starts to create a whole ecosystem of businesses that spring up around drug dens and spring up around the drug trade and around, the trade of weapons that facilitate the defending and the offense, right? So one of these black market industries begets the next, and the next begets the next. Because once you have a whole bunch of opium dens, then you're going to have a bunch of prostitution to go with it. And once you have all that, you're going to get a bunch of violence and gangs. And once you have that, you're going to be selling weapons, right? And you start to get all of these cycles of all of these black market industries. They all work together. Can't read that down there. That's a snippet from Wikipedia. And I like to use Wikipedia because if it can make it through to Wikipedia, it's a pretty dang mainstream fact. And you should still double check the sources. You should, walk it out there. But there's a lot of things that don't make it through to Wikipedia because they're too spicy. But a lot of it they just admit right there. 15 to 20% of all of the British Empire's revenue during the early 1800s was just coming from opium. 1/5 of the whole British Empire's incoming wealth was them selling drugs at gunpoint to China. That's the wealth that built what the British Empire was when our lovely ancestors told them to go F themselves. I mean, it was kind of, the timelines are kind of parallel there in a lot of ways, but we're talking about a couple hundred years when these tall ships were changing the nature of trade, and the people that had the money and the power were getting up to some very shady things with those technologies. So, if you're familiar with HSBC, that bank, with that logo. HSBC was founded by the British Empire on Hong Kong specifically to deal with all that opium money. HSBC was built on opium money in Hong Kong completely. That's all it was. It was just a bunch of opium smuggling, money laundering. And to this day, they have not changed very much. They like to make it look like they have. But that's just one example of how, like, you might have known that before, but I bet a lot of you didn't. And if you did not know that, you would think, I'm going to go in and get my debit card from this bank. It is a reputable financial institution. They do great things. Literally an opium smuggling den turned into a giant financial institution. That is not an uncommon story in the banking world. Most of them just did a better job of hiding it than HSBC. To this day, they still launder money. They're extremely prolific. They get caught doing it every year. That's just one of many examples. It says in 2003 and 2010, U.S. regulators ordered HSBC to strengthen their anti-money laundering practices. They've been caught in 2012. It goes on, and that's just one example, because what do? They get fined when they get caught breaking the law. And the fines are less than the profits. And so naturally, they all keep doing it. So money laundering, HSBC is an example of money laundering when it is kind of legal, because they were sanctioned by their government to do this drug trading. Like, they were just basically saying, we need someone to deal with all this money that all this opium is generating. Here's a bank. But that's essentially money laundering. It's turning the money from one trade out of that trade and into the rest of the world. And the only difference between that and like official money laundering is when a government says you're not allowed to turn that trade money into the rest of the world money. We're going to stop you, which they obviously never really do. But BCCI is another example. You might not have heard of BCCI. If you're a little older, you might have. This is during the Vietnam era. There's lots of digging you can do on this. This turned into the Iran-Contra scandal. But there's a lot of stuff that never really came out to the public. Stuff about George H.W. Bush being involved, stuff about Richard Helms from the CIA being involved, because what they were essentially doing is during Vietnam, there was a Vietnam War happening, but over in the border of Laos and China, in the Golden Triangle there, that is the epicenter of poppy growth, opium production, in the whole world at the time, before it had moved to Afghanistan. And we were trying to do stuff with communist China to try to like contain communist China, and a lot of that involved trying to do the opium thing to them all over again. They were wise to it and wouldn't really do it, but then the CIA boys that were doing all this opium stuff, in the 60s and 70s in Laos, were like, well, we've got all this opium, and we're not really getting it into China, but we could make a lot of money if we sold it to someone else. And so they figured they would sell it to the US soldiers fighting in Vietnam. And they did, in large numbers, like billions of dollars, and we have receipts. And when they did that, they understandably needed a bank, because you can't just fly around with billions of dollars of cash. Or at least it's tough. And so they set up a complex network of financial institutions, including BCCI, which is the one that got caught. There were a few others, Castle Bank and Trust, through this guy named Paul Helliwell. And what that then does is there's various ways that you get that money into the bank, kind of slush it around so you don't realize where the money came from, and then you send it back out to a legitimate institution so it looks like now that money has nothing to do with getting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers addicted to heroin in Vietnam. And that is why a lot of them came back with heroin problems, because we were cultivating it in Laos and selling it all to them, as well as all around the rest of the world via the French Connection. Just recently, you may remember that a certain bank got caught with a boat full of cocaine, and then the reporting just disappeared. Can't imagine what happened to that boat full of cocaine. But we're not here to talk about the boat full of cocaine. We're here to talk about his buddy, Jeff. And there's this weird piece of reporting. This is my favorite kind of sort of journalism to do, is the one where we've all been told a thing, and none of us really stop to think, like, what does that mean? Because during the whole scandal breaking, it kept coming up that JP Morgan's connection to Jeffrey Epstein was that Jeffrey Epstein was referring wealthy clients to JP Morgan. But obviously, Jamie Dimon didn't know what Jeffrey was up to. How could he? He was just a guy Nothing to do with it. Didn't even know he was there. Didn't know the guy, whatever. But the people that Jeffrey Epstein was referring to JP Morgan were people like Sergey Brin, the founder of Google, with billions and billions of dollars. People like Bill Gates with billions and billions of dollars, right? I bet that you could walk into JP Morgan and open a bank account tomorrow, and you would even know how to, like, you could just do it. So what was he referring them to? Right? Because I guarantee you a billionaire doesn't need help finding a bank. That's clearly not what they're being referred to, right? What is Jeffrey Epstein's specialty in this whole world? Is the black market, particularly trafficking, money laundering, all of these things. And so if you're going to Jeffrey Epstein for a referral to a bank, you're not asking where is the front door, you're asking where is the back door. And that is something that a Sergey Brin or a Bill Gates would need a referral for. Because I'm going to assume that none of you have ever bought any weed in your life, but I did when I was a teenager. And when you do that, you need to know a guy, right? The drug dealers don't just stand around being like, I sell drugs and you can come and get them from me. They operate on reputation, right? You got to know a guy that knows a guy, and he's got to trust you to introduce you. And once you get that referral, and he thinks you're cool and not sketchy and weird, then you can have his phone number and you can call him when you want to spend an hour getting blazed. That is the mechanic that you are observing right there. That is the I know a guy for billionaires. And clearly they're not buying weed, they are doing something else, very nefarious. And if Jeffrey Epstein is the guy you know that's giving you, I can only think of a few services that Jeffrey Epstein is an expert at. So there's that, right? And to clarify, I'm not even talking about the child stuff, right? The child stuff is something else, because you don't need a referral to JP Morgan to do the kids stuff. You need to go to the island, and they all did. But what you need to go to JP Morgan for is for the money stuff, right? Because JP Morgan is where you money launder. Otherwise, you'd be going in the front door to open a bank account like a normal human. The reason you go into the back door of JP Morgan is for massive illegal money services, and all of the banks do this. And it's not even all illegal is the thing. You know how they hide the weird stuff inside of like a shell company, inside of a shell company, inside of a shell company? That's how you do tax evasion. It's legal. It's how rich people evade taxes. You can go to wallstreetonparade.com, one of the greatest financial reporting websites in the world, and they will tell you all about how banks keep shell corporations pre-packaged on the shelf, so to speak, on the proverbial shelf. So when, a multimillionaire comes in and says like, hey, I need to open an account where I can put my money in a trust where it's safe, where the government's coming for me, and he's a good guy, government's coming for him unlawfully, and he's like, I just want to keep my money safe. What can you do for me? It's like, I got a thing, don't worry. You open up a trust, and that trust has a board of directors. Board of directors are allowed to be companies, and so you have 6 other trusts that open up. Those are the boards of directors of that trust. You're hidden in the ownership of one of those right over there. And other than that, it's just this nice little package. And so the ownership never gets shown because it's all private, so you can't even know. A company is owned by B, C, D, E, F companies. That's all you'll ever know because those are all private too. And then that, put all your money in that, goes into the Bahamas, gone. And they keep those pre-prepared on the shelf so that when someone wealthy walks in, they can just say, hey, I need a trust opened up. And they say, here you go. And that is very standard practice among the big banks that engage in what they call wealthy client services, because it's a service. And the difference between that and laundering hundreds of billions of dollars of black market money is almost nothing. The only difference is whether or not you find out about it, and you won't, because they won't tell you. So JP Morgan is real sketchy, and no one talks about them enough, and I bet that they just reported my TikTok video. And I notice it. On TikTok, I'm a quick detour. TikTok censors a lot, and I started on TikTok. And it became a guiding light. Because on TikTok, you'll get censored for all sorts of things, but I started to notice that at first I was talking about BlackRock, and I exploded. TikTok could not get enough of BlackRock content. And my views were all over the place. Like, I just blew up in a month. It was crazy. And then I started to realize that I wasn't quite at the answer yet. There was more to learn. And I started to get to the banks. And suddenly, it all changed. And then I got to Epstein, and suddenly I was getting videos taken down. And then I talked about JP Morgan, and videos are getting taken down. And then I was like, okay, now the CIA is involved, because Jeffrey Epstein is involved in the intelligence agencies, not just the CIA. And then now videos are all, so that becomes a guiding light. It's like, okay, clearly, if videos are getting taken down when I'm talking about the CIA and Jeffrey Epstein and JP Morgan, I know what my job is now. And if you're not aware, remember when they were telling you that TikTok was getting bought by China, or China owns TikTok? It's this big problem. They did it 1 year ago, and then they did it again more recently. Well, the first time, they did what's called Project Texas, which was how they were going to solve that problem, is they put all of the data servers for TikTok into Texas, guarded by an American company named Oracle. Oracle is founded by Larry Ellison, second or third, fourth richest man in the world. Oracle is one of the biggest companies in America. It was totally unrelated to the company he had named Oracle that he founded for the CIA 5 years prior. He closed that one down and never worked for the CIA again, and then opened a new company called Oracle that has nothing to do with the CIA, that just happens to be the world's largest data harvesting tech cloud-based company in the world that is now managing the data servers of TikTok. And so when I'm putting videos on TikTok and all the CIA videos and the Jeffrey Epstein videos and the JP Morgan videos are getting taken down, that's why I say, cool, now I know what my job is. Thank you. So, everybody needs banking. I was kind of running through a lot of different industries and how those industries can be black, they can be white, they can be gray, so to speak. But every industry needs a bank, right? Think about the slave trade. The slave trade is the human trafficking trade. It just used to be legal, right? And the whole slave trade all over the world, and it was not just American slave trade, it was like inter-African slave trade, it was European slave trade, Southeast Asia, it was all over the place. And that whole industry needed banking, right? And so there's this whole industry based upon capturing humans, selling them around, taking that profit. There's all kinds of industries that spring up around that, whether it is sex slavery, whether it is labor slavery, whether it's like combat slavery, all kinds of slavery. And then it started to get illegalized. And if we know anything, it's when you ban something, all the people that make money off of it stop doing it, and they close up shop, and they leave, and they go somewhere else, and they do a new job. And so it's likely that once the slave trade was illegalized, all of the slave traders stopped slave trading. And all of the money that was coming into their pockets through the slave trade stopped coming into their... You see where I'm going with that? Think about the size of the slave trade back then. Think about how much smaller it got when you made it illegal. I'll give you a hint. When drugs get illegal, they make more money, right? When guns become illegal, you can sell them for 5 times as much, right? When people become illegal, you can sell them for 5 times as much, or more. I'm making those numbers up. I have no idea, right? So we have this narrative given to us, which I'm highly suspicious of, that, there is human trafficking, but it's not that big of a deal. It's not that bad. Okay, well, let's look at what it used to be, and where's the signs that it got any smaller? All I know is that it got illegaler, so it got more profitable. Sure, it got harder to do, but they all need banking still. All these human traffickers. If only there was a bank that would be willing to work with human traffickers. The arms trade, right? Same thing. The same gun sells for 5 times as much if it's not supposed to be there, if it doesn't have a serial number, right? And a lot of the arms trade actually comes from our government. It comes from the CIA. Like, we armed the Mujahideen that were fighting in Afghanistan to fight against Russia, to keep communist Russia out of Afghanistan. And then this dude named Osama was like, man, that was fun. Went on to found the Taliban. A lot of those dudes that we trained, that we gave the guns to, did some stuff later. And that's just one example. The CIA has done that over and over and over and over again. And but I'm sure that the guys we're giving guns to now will be different. But fortunately, the black market, all these guys in the black market, they They may not pay taxes, but they do report very well. They self-report their numbers, and it's very accurate. And so we know very clearly that the whole black market is worth $2.55 trillion. I'm noticing that I'm getting more and more sarcastic as we go, to the point where I'm not even giving you the sarcastic tone. Imagine, so we're being told by the internet that the black market is $2.55 trillion. I'm going to leave it up to you to imagine how low that number is compared to the reality. If you just think about like the size of the slave trade before it was illegal, maybe how profitable it would be once it isn't, like. And again, it would be hard to get away with all these industries because we have this global network of reporters that tell us the truth. And they go out there with their microphones and their video cameras, and they're holding the powerful to account. And when they find a bad guy, they'll tell us everything they know about him. And so if that's not happening, actually, why would it be all that hard to do black market stuff, right? It would be hard if the government makes it hard, but if the government's taking a cut, if they're taking a fine when they catch JP Morgan doing this, and it's like, okay, now you have to pay us, $1.3 billion, whatever the fine is, I mean, then the government's probably pretty stoked, right? Like, that just funded their whole program. Now they can sell $1.3 billion worth of weapons over there. They don't have to put that money over there. And again, I'm speaking in generalities. I'm not saying that everyone in government is thinks that way. But it sure looks like someone in government is thinking that way. So the black market is really big. And don't worry, you don't have to read all that stuff. This is just hilarious. I was reading through these documents that have to do with this heroin smuggling operation in Vietnam that never quite broke, but I have this whole cache of documents that are like notarized and they're like original documents. There's like a lot of evidence that okay, this looks pretty real. And in those documents, they allege in those documents to me that the OECD is a part of this money laundering scheme that the CIA set up to work with the Rothschild family, which is the bank, because the Rothschilds are a giant banking family. And they allege to me that the OECD is in on this scandal, this scheme, to help them launder their drug money into what they're calling like international aid projects, right? And this is allegedly, right? I see a lot of evidence, but right now let's treat it as allegedly. So what they're claiming is that the CIA is doing this heroin operation in Vietnam, and they need someone to launder the money. So they go to the Rothschild buddies, because they've helped each other out in the past, they're buddies, and they say, hey, we need banking services to help us get this money from drug money into clean money. No problem. You send it to the OECD, which is an international aid and development organization. They take it in and kind of like scrub how they got that, and then they send it out as like helping Mexico build this giant highway that's going to cost $1.1 billion or whatever it is, and you just like exaggerate and fudge a lot of lines along the edges, and there's a whole bunch of money that just kind of sloughs off in other places. But then I go to look up the OECD to see if there's anything to this, and on the OECD's website, I realize that they have set up the Financial Action Task Force, which is a whole task force designed to combating money laundering worldwide. And I got to researching the OECD from a cache of like 194 pages of documents that are notarized, that are like original scans of like bank statements. It's like a solid cache of evidence that directly claims that the OECD is in on a CIA heroin money laundering scheme. And that's a pattern you see over and over again, where actually the people that say they're combating a thing, like child trafficking, are actually the child traffickers, because there's no better way to get close to child trafficking than to say you're going to stop it. So how do we launder money? There's a lot of ways, and they're all pretty fun. Well, that's a lie. There's a lot of ways, and they're funny. Art is the obvious one. Its value is arbitrary. It's easy to buy and sell anonymously. You can make up whatever price you want. It's like, boom, my painting. I'm Hunter Biden. I made this splatter painting. It is now worth $100 million. You suddenly just need to carry around like Hunter Biden's really beautiful painting, and that is worth $100 million. Take it over there. And all you need is the agreement, right? As long as you're laundering between people that agree that this is worth this, like a network of buddies that are all in on these weird schemes, that works. And art has been used for money laundering since before we have records of art. Like, it's the most obvious, but there are a lot of other really interesting ones. I want to point out my last bullet point there. One that a lot of people don't think about is the music industry. This is one that I'm kind of digging up currently on the Diddy trail. The music industry has been tied to criminal organizations ever since the music industry was founded, at least in America. I don't personally know about the rest of the world. But a lot of people don't think about how gray area the incoming and outgoing money in the music industry is, right? If I throw a concert, how many people attended? How many tickets did I sell? How much did I charge? How much did I make on liquor? How many albums did I sell? How many shirts did I sell? How much did I pay my artist? Right? All of those numbers are kind of concrete, but there's hundreds of millions of dollars of fudging that can be done very easily. If I throw a party at Diddy's mansion, if my name's Lucien Grange and I run Universal Music Group, we'll get there in a second, and I throw a party at Diddy's mansion that's full of underage girls and spiked drinks and cameras, while I'm doing whatever that was, I could very easily say and I paid these 6 performers $1 million to show up. When in reality, I own them and I own their contracts, and I've got blackmail on them because they went to the last party, and so they just showed up for free. And I have just laundered $6 million into an expense that I did not have. That goes into the bank as an artist expense when it came from drugs or whatever it came from. And suddenly that bank has cleaned that money because it was paid, and then suddenly it's back out into the world. That's how money laundering works, is you need to make illegitimate money look legitimate in a payment form that is fudgeable until it gets into a bank account by legitimate means, quote. And then it can go back out and it's all good, it's clean. And the music industry has a long history of doing this, for simplicity's sake, generally what's happening is you have black street gangs sort of doing the dirty on the streets, working for mostly white and Jewish and Italian street gangs above them that are doing all the financial crimes, keeping their hands dirty. So you have sort of the dirty money here getting laundered up into the legitimate business practices here and exiting out of the music industry. And we'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow. But let's talk about Lucien for a second. If you don't know what happened with Diddy recently, you're welcome. You don't listen to horrible music. But my generation grew up with all this rap music, right? And we were all at the party, yeah, this is so great. And we didn't realize that almost all of the music that was produced during my generation, this gangster rap stuff, that whole generation was built around people like Diddy. And it turns out that Diddy has actually been doing weird sexual blackmail stuff ever since he got promoted. And it looks more and more the more we open it. So there's a case where someone whistle blew, brought tons of evidence. There's a whole file on it, did a bunch of digs on it. It's wild. Anyways, it's looking more and more like that whole generation of music was actually created by sexual blackmail operations where they were recruiting gangster rappers that were degenerates, and a lot of them were gay because you can blackmail a gay person really easily in the music industry if you stoke anti-gay sentiment. That's an old trick from the Cold War. It was called the Lavender Scare. If you make everyone hate gay people, then suddenly all the gay people are super blackmailable, right? But they still want to do gay stuff. And so if you go up to them and you're like, yo, I'll do gay stuff and I won't even tell anyone. Just come in this room, we'll have some drinks and we'll do the gay stuff back there. And psych, there's cameras. Then you have a great relationship by which you can then tell them to do whatever you want. And I'm not saying I have no problem with gay people, love them. But don't go to a Diddy party because it's a bad move. And so it turns out that we find out that Diddy is hosting these parties. Then we find out that the CEO of Universal Music Group, Lucien Grange, they're pictured in the yellowish, he's attending them, he's funding them, he knows that the drinks are spiked, he knows there's underage girls there. Lucien Grange is the head of the largest music company in the world. They produced 33 out of the top 100 songs last year. A lot of the songs that you looked at and were like, this is satanic trash, like Unholy by Sam Smith, he produced that. He manages Taylor Swift. There's a lot of these people that are producing degenerate music that happen to work for this guy. I'm getting distracted because we're supposed to be talking about money laundering, but I just don't like him. And the music industry is one way that there's a long history of sort of the criminal class mingling at these parties with the celebrity class. And the moment you have celebrity or parties or all of those expenses are gray areas. And you can pay P. Diddy $1 million to show up at the party, when actually what you did was a sexual favor or a blackmail thing or whatever, and that $1 million becomes laundered. Plenty more to come on that. That's a whistleblower. That black is a whistleblower message to me online that I cut the information out of, just kind of going over in depth how this is done, and it's done for a long time in the music industry. It's kind of an open secret. So we have, in many ways, like the black gangster class, and this is like well known in the space. There's a black gangster class that kind of is like does the dirty work, and then there's kind of like a banker class over them that keeps their hands clean and their collars tight, and we will meet them next week. Clive Davis, right there on the right, he's the guy that found Diddy when Diddy was like a 21-year-old gangster and was like, this guy should have a whole record label. I'm going to fund him to have this record label. He's got all this talent, meaning he's gay and degenerate, and I can tell him what to do, and he'll run a sexual blackmail ring for me. And he made Diddy what he was in a lot of ways. He also managed people like Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead. Whole history in the music industry we won't go into. But another example is Hollywood. Hollywood is full of celebrities that you pay who knows how much to do who knows what. And productions cost, like how much does a movie cost to produce again? Right? How much did you make on ticket sales? Or at that Golden Globe event or whatever it is? No one knows. And when you hear about how like that movie grossed this much, it cost this much, it's like, prove it? Like that is, I mean, maybe, but that's just made up numbers, right? And imagine, how are they reporting it? How are they measuring it? Especially back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, when it's all on paper, it's like, right? This is a massive production. And Hollywood was infiltrated by the mafia and the mob from the start. So all of this to say that money laundering happens in places that we don't normally think of, right? It happens in regular businesses in your town, too. Those are just really lucrative places to do it. And we're slightly alluding to the fact that we're going to talk about organized crime tomorrow night, and it's going to get spicy. We're going to talk a lot about Prohibition tomorrow night, too, because Prohibition was one of those moments where organized crime and the open markets suddenly were really good buddies. And it fundamentally changed the future of this whole country, the whole world, hearkening back to that whole, like, when you make something illegal, what happens to the people that sell the thing? They make a lot more money, and they get a lot more criminal about it. And then sometimes the CIA goes up to them and is like, hey, would you do a job for me? Classic money laundering. Las Vegas was basically built by organized crime for organized crime, and it still is that way today. Bugsy Siegel is famous for being one of the first pioneers of Las Vegas before one of the other gangsters shot him because he didn't like him. And you can just imagine all the money laundering that happens in Las Vegas. So we have all these criminal organizations that have all this money, they're doing all this banking, and they're laundering all this money through all of these various industries. So now you have the black market services, drugs, guns, trafficking, whatever, working with all of these, front market industries, Hollywood, music industry, whatever, banks, financial institutions. So you got all this complex, convoluted relationships between people that we would like to not have relationships if we were to live in a just world, right? And then the CIA gets involved, because that's what the CIA does. And they've been involved in many ways, but a classic and obvious example is Operation Underworld, which was during World War II. Let's just say the US government seemed to be having trouble securing the eastern seaboard, the ports. Although it looks more and more like it was actually the mafia doing the problem, they were inside. Anyways, but they were worried that the Germans would be able to get in because the mafia could do whatever they wanted there already. And so the only way they could figure to secure the eastern seaboard during World War II was to go and ask the mafia to do it for them, very literally. And so the CIA went and hired the mafia and the mob to secure all of the ports along the eastern seaboard. And what do you do with ports? You import and export things, right? Like every illegal good on the planet. And if I know one thing about the mafia and the mob, it's that when you give them access to a port, they will happily give it back to you later when you ask them nicely. So, during World War II, we hand control over the entire eastern seaboard to the mafia and the mob, which by then are really the same organization. We will talk more about that tomorrow. That's your guy, Meyer Lansky in the center, who is responsible for merging the mafia and the mob into what was often called Crime Inc., literally. They named themselves that. That happened in like the 40s. What I was talking about with the whole Vietnam heroin smuggling operations, that happened in like the 70s. What happened with the Iran-Contra scandal, that happened in like the 80s, right? I'm sure it stopped, but it seemed to be going on for an awfully long time. We'll leave that for tomorrow. But the point of the story is that everyone needs banking. The black market needs banking too, right? We all need a bank, right? Like, imagine if Mark runs this whole business, takes in all his money, and tries to do it all without a bank. Like, you could probably pull it off, but you'd be hanging on to a lot of cash. It would be very problematic. How do you pay everyone, right? And this is just one business with a couple businesses associated. The moment you're running big empires, big corporate, everyone needs a bank, and people doing black market stuff need banks just as much as everyone else. And it's not like there's a bunch of secret banks out there that no one, there are some, right? There's a space called shadow banking, but you can all go to those too. They're not, it's just because they're sketchy. So all of these banks, we won't go through their rap sheets, but they all get caught and fined every year for things like money laundering. They get caught and fined every year for misreporting information, for not reporting information. They get caught and fined for actively manipulating markets in foreign countries, like tanking prices. They do all kinds of things, and they get fined every year, billions, billions, billions of dollars, right? They work with people like Jeffrey Epstein, okay? They work like the Rothschilds. I don't need to say any more about them, but the guy on the right, Michael Milken, I don't know if any of you know about Michael Milken. During the 80s, he was the most famous financial criminal in the world. He was both the highest paid individual ever. He got over $1 billion in a year as his salary, but it was because he was committing so much financial crime that he then became the most notorious financial criminal when they took him down. But he got a pardon recently. I'm not happy with Trump for doing that. So there are criminals all over the banking industry. Because the banking industry does not exactly incentivize you being a good person, right? There's nothing about the banking industry that says, we want your best, brightest, and most moral humans, right? If anything, the banking industry attracts the greediest, most corruptible, most corrupt people. And then they wind up walking into this industry where the way you get to the top is by doing what the people at the top need you to do. And what they need you to do is launder Jeffrey Epstein's money for him or any of his other buddies. Right? Because, you make a lot more money dealing with a high-value, wealthy client that needs all these weird trusts set up. You can skim a lot more off of $5 billion of human trafficking money than you can skim off of my $500 paycheck, right? So the way they make money off of your $500 paycheck is actually by charging a bunch of fees that you don't know about and doing weird things with your money and actually giving your money away and loaning it out. And if it crashes, no big deal, we'll get bailed out. Like, they do this whole other thing with our money to make money off of us, which is also messed up. No more bailouts. But with the wealthy clients, all they need to do is service them because they can get massive returns just from servicing them. So you should make your own financial decisions, and you should educate yourself. But some things you might want to educate yourself about are physical metals. The physical metal markets are highly manipulated, and JP Morgan is famous for manipulating them, and they have been caught and fined for doing so many times, okay? But that does not change the fact that a physical bar of gold or silver is a physical money that will always have value. What a bar of gold bought you 100 years ago, a bar of gold will still buy you today because it's real money. Paper is a whole different, we'll not go into the fiat money thing right now. But you should consider credit unions, local credit unions. The nature of a credit union is banks gamble with your money. You deposit your money in a bank, and they go and do 2008 stuff with it, right? It's an exaggeration. That's it's just a phrasing. But banks gamble with your money. Credit unions do not. Credit unions keep your money in a local economy. They mostly don't invest it out. Like, credit unions are a much safer, more local way to store your money where you're not handing it to Jamie Dimon saying, do whatever you want with it, just keep, 7% of it in, or whatever the regulation is wherever you live. Learning about cryptocurrencies and bitcoins. It can seem extremely complicated at first, especially if you're in the older generations, but the technology behind, I mean, there's a lot of scams out there because any new technology comes with scams. But what the technology behind this stuff does is it uses math, which is immutable. It turns math into money. And it lets you trade, it lets math be the thing that joins all money together. And math is inherently decentralized, and it can't be broken, it can't be controlled. Like, it's just math. And what that means is that the banks can no longer control it. No one can take it from you. As long as there's an internet connection anywhere in the world, various versions of this will exist, and it is unbreakable. Most of them, there are scams, but it requires a lot of education. So I would encourage you to educate yourself. Bitcoin is a good place to start, but that is going to fundamentally change. Banks will never be able to control it. It will grow and grow and grow, and it will fundamentally return the power of money to the people that was taken when they invented the idea of writing a paper note that said, I owe you. Okay? So it's going to happen either way. I would recommend you learn about it, but it's a lot to learn, so take your time. The most important thing is that you just learn about anything and everything. The reason why they can all control us is because we don't know how it works. We don't know how money works. We don't know how stocks work. We don't know how we don't know what history even is at this point. We certainly don't know what's going on with the whole guy on the roof shooting at our president. And so there's all these things that they rely on us being ignorant about in order for them to control. So learn. Get your kids curious about things. Get your kids learning. That's even more important than you because obviously our kids are the future. So that's how we fix it. And it's not an easy answer, but that's all I got.